Thank you, Barbara. Hello and welcome to Encounters, New Perspectives on Asia, America, and Europe. My name is Welle Ferner. I am the director of the HCA, the Heidelberg Center for American Studies at Heidelberg University. With my colleague Barbara Mittler, founding director of CATS, the Center for Asian and Transcultural Studies, I would like to briefly introduce this new series of dialogues jointly initiated by our two institutes. Before we will do so, I would like to share with you that yesterday, Heidelberg University was struck by a terrible incident. A shooting at the med school left 2 of our students dead and several wounded. The entire university is shocked and grieves for the victims of this act. Our hearts go out to them and their families and to the students and colleagues who witnessed these terrible events. We cannot yet grasp what has happened, but as an academic community, we stand together in these difficult hours. It is difficult to go back to business as usual after what has happened. Please permit me to ask you for a moment of silence before we proceed. Let us now please proceed with the introduction of our Encounters series. The events in this series focus on the relationship between the two superpowers of the 21st century, the United States of America and the People's Republic of China. With a stunning rise of the People's Republic in recent decades, this relationship has become increasingly contentious. China's growing self-confidence is a challenge for the US and its allies alike, and thus also embroils Europe in this new trans-Pacific geopolitical rivalry. While Europe's security continues to be guaranteed by the United States, its economic ties to China have grown considerably over the last decades. As a result, the European Union and its individual member states are looking for a safe haven somewhere in this simmering conflict. It is our conviction, therefore, that we need to know more about these two nations that will shape the world of the 21st century. Our series of encounters offers a forum for discussion of multifaceted challenges in which a deeper understanding of Asian and American cultural heritage will play an important role. We hope that these dialogues will thus contribute to an informed debate on one of the most imminent challenges for Germany and Europe.
Now, how do we envisage doing this? Our Encounters series brings prominent Chinese and American policymakers, as well as authors, artists, activists, public intellectuals, and representatives from the business community to Heidelberg University. Our guests will engage in a dialogue with scholars from the CATS and the Heidelberg Center for American Studies. We're thus looking forward to a series of nuanced discussions on a wide range of controversial topics that are shaping the exceptional relationship between an established and an emerging superpower. We will zoom in on issues such as the environmental crisis and trade wars, questions of technology transfer and innovation, white-collar crime and digital surveillance, and last but not least, human rights and freedom of expression. In order to provide multiple perspectives on China-US relations, we will consider different Chinese voices from the mainland, as well as from Taiwan and Hong Kong. We will also offer contrasting American perspectives from politics to the economy and the arts. Thus, we will analyze newly emerging political and geostrategic constellations in a multipolar world with two strong rivals and discuss their consequences for Germany and Europe. How do the European Union and its member states position themselves in the competition between China and the United States? What are their current positions and strategies? What will the future bring to this new global landscape? Our encounters will seek answers to these questions, and we thank you already now for joining us in what we hope to be a series of inspiring exchanges. Now, before we begin, just a few technical matters. We would ask you to always keep your microphone muted unless later in the question and answer section you want to speak up when we call on you. But we welcome you to open the videos if your bandwidth allows this. If there is any trouble with the connections or any such thing, there is a technical support in the chat that you can call. Herr Kramer will be at your service whenever something goes wrong with regard to the Zoom meeting, that is. And now, without further ado, Welf will introduce our two speakers of today.
Thank you, Barbara. Yes, I would like to welcome you once again now to the second event of Encounters, which is entitled Visions of a New Global Order, A View from China. It is my great pleasure and privilege to introduce the participants of today's event. Wang Hui is professor in the Department of Chinese Language and Literature at one of China's elite universities, Tsinghua University in Beijing. His research focuses on Chinese literature and intellectual history. Between 1996 and 2007, he was executive editor of the influential magazine Dushu, founded as a monthly in 1979 during the democracy movement with a famous slogan, "No forbidden zone in reading." It was under Wang Hui and Huang Ping that Dushu emerged as a socially critical journal, uncongenial to some, but nevertheless posing questions that undoubtedly resonated widely. Wang Hui has been a visiting professor at Harvard, Edinburgh, Bologna, Stanford, UCLA, Berkeley, Göttingen, Heidelberg, and many other universities. In 2008, the US magazine Foreign Policy named him as one of the 100 most influential public intellectuals in the world. His books include The End of Revolution, China and the Limits of Modernity, published with Verso in 2010, China's New Order, Society, Politics and Economy in Transition, published in 2003 with Harvard University Press, and The Politics of Imagining Asia, published in 2011, also with Harvard University Press. Joining Wang Hui this afternoon is Marina Rudyak, an assistant professor at the Institute of Chinese Studies at Heidelberg University. Her research focuses on China's international development cooperation, global China, and coded communication in China's public diplomacy. Her doctorate dissertation, Becoming a Donor, National Role Conceptions, Reform Dynamics and Learning in China's Foreign Aid System, traces the evolution of China's foreign aid since the early days of the People's Republic. Marina Rudyak is the co-author of the Decoding China Dictionary and the author of the China Aid blog. Previously, she was a development professional for the German Agency for International Cooperation in Beijing. She's also a member of the Global Diplomacy Lab and the BMW Foundation Responsible Leaders Network. Maria Rudyak serves as policy advisor for governmental and non-governmental organizations on issues related to Chinese aid, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, and China in Africa. I'm now looking forward to the conversation on visions of a new global order. Please be kindly advised to keep your mics turned off and to use the chat for your questions. Marina Rudyak and Wang Hui, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Werner. So thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Werner, for your introduction. Just to make sure, can you hear me well? Yes, the important question in the virtual space. So it's a pleasure for me to guide through the dialogue with Professor Wang Hui, to engage in a dialogue with him. And I would just like to note briefly that it's not only this time a dialogue with China or a global dialogue, it's also a dialogue across generations of scholars, because I am of a younger generation. And I just would like to express how envious some colleagues of mine were that I have the opportunity to engage in a dialogue with Professor Wang Hui, who also for China scholars of my generation is a very admired Chinese public intellectual. As Professor Werner said in the introduction, we need to know more about China and the US in Europe at this point in time. But we also have to acknowledge where we stand. And that is that if we are honest, while we need to know probably equally much about both, we do know much more about the US than we do know about China. And we are facing a huge asymmetry of knowledge because, in fact, China knows us as Europe much better than we do know China, and probably China knows the US much better than the US knows China. One barrier is probably the language, because if we want to understand US politics, we can go and just read the New York Times or watch the news. It's difficult to do the same when it comes to China, because as we all know, only few of us are literate in Chinese, while maybe 5% of everything that is published openly in China is translated. Another issue maybe is that for a long time in the West, there was the assumption that as China develops, as China follows up the path of reform and opening, it will become more like us, the West. At some point, at latest, since the onset of the era of Xi Jinping, and a disillusionment set in that obviously China has not become more like us. And the New York Times ran a very interesting headline saying China failed to fail, because for a very long time, everybody was waiting that China's authoritarian model will fail, and it didn't. Instead, we are facing a G2 world with not only shifting power structures, but also with China proposing another or alternative vision of how international relations should happen. And this vision can be equated to a term that has been raised very often both by Chinese officials, by Chinese intellectuals, also by President Xi Jinping himself, namely that the world needs a community of shared future for mankind. This is a term that has been promulgated as a new concept of global governance and as an alternative to what many Chinese actors have described as the old or Western-dominated type of international relations, which they consider to echo a Cold War mentality and a confrontational zero-sum game. In Europe and the United States, the term has received a mixed reception. Some have interpreted it as China's commitment to multilateralism. For example, Klaus Schwab, the head of the World Economic Forum, very much praised Xi Jinping for reminding that we are all part of a community of shared future, and for his commitment to multilateralism. especially during the tenure of Donald Trump, when the United States retreated from the global arena. Others see the promulgation of the term, especially in United Nations organizations, as an attempt to undermine the liberal international order. And in fact, again, the United States have made a lot of efforts not to have the term community of shared future for mankind included in official documents, arguing that the shared future, in fact, means that there should be no universal values, but rather something like the least common denominator. One thing that can be said definitely is that neither in Europe nor in the United States, there is a clear understanding of what the term community of shared future for mankind actually means. And the question is there a clear definition, or is there a debate within China, between Chinese intellectuals and also between the intellectuals in the state, of what this exactly is, how it should look like, and which historical legacies and thought traditions are shaping it. So with that, I would like to hand over the word to Professor Wang Hui to give us a Chinese view, maybe his Chinese view, or tapping into the debates in China of what is it about the community of shared future for mankind, and how does the state of the world look at the moment from a Chinese perspective? Professor Wang Hui, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Maria. And also thanks Professor Werner and Professor Mittler. It's really nice for me to revisit in the screen, of course, to Heidelberg. So that exactly 19 years ago, I think, in 2003, in the spring, during the period of the SARS, I visit Heidelberg, spent the one semester there, where I really enjoyed the stay there. So it's another time I really hope that I can visit in person the Heidelberg. First of all, it's sad to hear the news about the shooting. It's really happened in such a beautiful city. It's really sad. As you may know that I'm not a specialist for the geopolitics or international relations and so on and so forth. I'm mainly the intellectual historian and the literary historian too. So, but I try my best to think about this issue. And it's just to remind Maria's comments, it reminded me of one thing, that last year, the Falling Wall Forum in Germany, actually every year they have publicized some 10 top 10 the scientists, the social scientist achievements. The top one was given to the Margaret Levy's work, which actually focuses on the issue, namely the expanded community of faith. I serve as a juror. When we discussed about it, I told them there was almost the same, the slogan or the idea that from China to talk about the community for the shared future for the humankind. That means go beyond the old boundary of the nation state and try to expand it, a kind of global community, the new idea for thinking politically at that time. I think it's the interesting, everybody, I think at that time, at least among the jurors, nobody knows about it. But now I guess more and more people knows about it. So here I try to give a short statement about, to talk about my understanding and the contemporary issues. Then we can discuss about in details on these issues. Now, we are living in the era of so-called the COVID-19, the era of COVID-19. There was an art exhibition in Beijing last year, which entitled 2020 Plus, means that there were some completely different conditions for the development of after the 2020, after the birth of the COVID-19. So at that time, when someone asked me, what is the uniqueness of this year's epidemic? I think there were three characteristics. The first is its scale and the speed. And it started from one place to quickly spread to all other places with global involvement. The length of time and the breadth of the spread are unprecedented. Without the conditions of the globalization, the epidemic will not happen at such a speed and a scale. So it is impossible to discuss the epidemic without thinking about the contradictions contained in the globalization process. I think that the issue, the background for us, we talk about the community of shared future for the humankind became more urgent than before. Secondly, the epidemic crisis is not a single crisis, not a simple public health crisis, but also a chain of series of crises. The pandemic has accelerated the other existing crises and triggered new ones. So it is also a crisis of geopolitics, economic and social political crisis. It's everything, almost everything, every side touched by these current crises. All kinds of the social crises are involved at the same time and intertwined in the pandemic. So these are the chain of crisis, the second, I think. Third, I think, these chains crises highlight a contradiction. That is the contradiction between the first level is the old concept, the older language, and the new conditions. So we use our familiar terms and the language to describe the conditions, but it's unlimited. And that's why, on the one hand, we talk about the so-called the community of shared future for humankind. Sounds a little bit abstract, but on the other hand, it's really new because we really need some new language for describe the condition. Then we can imagine what kind of the future for us. So in today's pandemic, the situation, the spread of the virus leads to the social distance in the process of the pandemic prevention. However, to maintain this social distance, it is necessary to implement isolation and rely on collective recognition on a large scale. We need a community, a unit, an organization, and a country to protect it. That is to say, the epidemic has redefined the community and the communities. But the language used to express these relationships is basically in an older pattern. In fact, this is not only the older language, but also the older language in the older relationship. For example, the crisis is global, but the protection mainly occurs within the framework of nation state. We clearly know that it is impossible for a single country to be immune. But in fact, globally, the prevention of pandemic situation is still the country or the nation state centered. How to describe the crisis in a new language is an imaginative problem. Recently, there are many friends actually in Europe and in some other places put forward a vaccine internationalism. I think these are vaccine internationalism reflect the needs for such the new conditions, I think. So it is necessary to rethink the internationalism, not the 20th century type, not the 19th century type maybe, but it's a new type for the new conditions. At present, China exports and donates the vaccine on a large scale, which exceeds the sum of all other countries. In the Tango crisis, such vaccine internationalism was quickly interpreted by other forces as geopolitics, competition, and so on and so forth. It's also defined by some people here too. How to describe such a behavior? We need a new language to describe such behavior patterns, which eventually oriented to give us some new orientation for our new behavior in such conditions, I think. Since the end of the Cold War, there have been two most prominent themes. One is the end of history, of course. That's very famous. The other is even more famous, is the clash of civilizations, one after another. However, if we observed under today's conflict conditions, the defects and the weakness of these two descriptions are completely exposed. As far as the Asian regions is concerned, actually since the 19th century, Northeast Asia has been undergoing drastic changes continuously. This change is actually a part of the continuous change since the Europe-centered era of so-called the maritime era, and actually from the 16th century, of course. The whole conflict in this area contains two main features afterwards, especially in the 19th century. The first feature is that from the 19th century or even earlier, the competition among big powers in this region is continuous phenomena. In the early days, there were conflicts between Britain and Russia, and Japan and Russia. Then there were conflicts between Japan and the United States, competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. And then there were, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, was the rise of China, all of which were constantly changing. Of course, the players were changing, but basically it's still in this region. The big power competition was a long phenomenon. It's not new. On the one hand, we have the new condition, but on the other hand, these phenomena that were why we in such a condition, our imagination even sometimes actually throw us back to the old pattern of thinking. It's partly because that phenomena was continuous phenomena for long term. Therefore, in the sense of geopolitics, we can regard this geopolitical crisis as a continuation of the conflicts between the major powers that have spread to this day and have not been completely finished. The new phenomena is that with the changes in the 19th century, especially I think it's mainly the 20th century, the industrialization conditions in Northeast Asia, which are rare in other non-Western regions, have become more and more important in the global economy and the politics. Today, the second largest economy and the third largest economy, as well as the 12th largest economy, are all gathered in this area. So if we add up the GDP of China, Japan, and South Korea, it already accounts for a considerable part of the global economy, which higher than the EU and almost equal to the US, I think. This is an unprecedented phenomenon, which contains the possibilities of change of the old monopoly structures. Because we talk about the old monopoly structure means that the monopoly of technology, the monopoly of financial markets, the monopoly of the natural resources, the monopoly of massive destruction weapons, and the monopoly of mass media. And all these were some new possibilities to transform these kind of global structures. However, globally speaking, we have no such a framework, a new political framework to surpass the old nation state and the political social organization, the new forms. We have no such new forms. And also now it's still difficult, I mean, in the globally speaking, it's no global governance that is adapted to the change, especially the rise of Asia and some old peripheral areas, the political economic relations. So I think that from the perspective of geopolitics, this is a major change in the past the century, even longer, maybe the 500th century or the 100th century, 500 years or the 100 years, that a different perspective to see. The shift of the geopolitical center of gravity is taking place. But without the new framework, it's created uncertainty now. So a lot of the geopolitical crisis happened in these, I think that the broad context. This is the first question we need to discuss and think about, I think. Simply speaking, it is better to understand the so-called clash of civilization is a longer historical process, because the so-called civilization of the clash of civilization in these themes itself is a concept produced in the historical process of the colonialism, imperialism, racism in the 19th century. We can describe the so-called clash of civilizations in this long history of the colonialism and the capitalism. The second feature of this area is the juxtaposition of the multiple heritages. That's the that is to say, the colonial heritage has spread to this day and still affects this area. The Cold War and the post-Cold War, none of these legacies is completely ended. The colonial legacy, the legacy of the Cold War, and the legacy of post-Cold War have all changed in these places. The conditions for forming new identity politics still exist here. We can see that some conflicts related to the early colonial time or the Cold War time, even the post-Cold War time. So this is an overlapping process. This is an area with multiple contradictions and multiple historical relations. Globally, the conclusion of the end of the history, so-called, assumes the contradiction between the past social systems, mainly the end of the contradiction between the so-called capitalism and the socialism, that the typical dichotomy of the Cold War period. But we can see that all kinds of the new social conflicts are being repackaged with the old ideology. And it seems that the more hegemonic countries dominated by the United States, the more emphasis now they put on the ideology. In this sense, the discussion of the so-called end of ideology seems to have ended too. Among the juxtapositions crisis I mentioned here, one of the most striking features in Asia is the juxtaposition of the Cold War and the post-Cold War. The juxtaposition of the two has the most direct influence on this area. The contemporary world orders was formed by the end of the socialist system and the end of the Cold War. We often talk about the end of the Cold War, but in fact, in East Asia, actually globally speaking too, the Cold War never ended, especially in Asia. We can see that the Korean Peninsula, Taiwan Strait, and all these kind of the Sino-Japanese relations were still deeply influenced by that legacy of Cold War. The so-called end of the Cold War was actually not caused by the reconciliation between the two sides, but ended with the failure of one side. So that, to some extent, China was exceptional, because after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, China was still here. And China started the market reform much earlier. As a result, but in any case, as a result, the victorious party completely ignored the crisis hidden in its own social system that defined the atmosphere of the post-Cold War period. From these, we can see that the contemporary world situation is the crisis of dual political systems. The first is the crisis of political system marked by the collapse of the socialist state system. That is the socialist system in Eastern Europe, represented by Soviet Union. Still, that the framework still exists in its different ways, alternatively, in China, Vietnam, and some other countries. But with the end of the Cold War crisis, end of the world system, we can see another system that is a crisis. We call it the crisis of democracy that people are discussing today. That is the system on the winning side in the Cold War itself is in crisis. The reason behind the phenomenon, often described as for example, the populism and so on, is the second crisis. Actually, that is the democratic crisis. In this sense, the old language can hardly describe the nature of political crisis, because you can talk about the crisis in China or others, and by blaming it as non-democratic, but how to relate it to the so-called democratic societies. They shared a lot of the crisis. So these set of the expositions represented by the conclusion of history, democratic and non-democratic ones, can be said to be inflationary language, sometimes overused and became no substantive connotation today. The real crisis that different political systems here and there, I think, are facing today. Politically, I used 10 years ago, actually, I gave a talk at the ESPE Day that at that time, in Germany, in Berlin, I called the decline of the representation. What is I just summarize and not want to repeat what I talked 10 years ago, but basically that is the basic form of the political system is out of touch with its social form, globally and domestically. We look at the wave of first crisis, the end of the socialist system in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. It is the disconnection between its basic political value and social form. People can't be the real masters of society, which constitutes a contradiction with legitimacy of socialism. Because if you read the constitution and the charters of the party, they always claim that the rulers were the working class and so on and so forth, here and there, Soviet in China too. Today, the crisis, but it's the complex. Today, the crisis of democracy is also the disconnection between the political form and the social form. Because these forms of political democracy and the voting system can't solve the problems of high inequality and division at the social level. And the problem that party politics can't represent the opinion of different social groups and so on. People want to express it directly beyond the framework of the party politics, and the resulting chaotic situation is often described as a populism, because it's still the case. We have no such a new framework to fit the new conditions. So the populism is fundamentally the product of these crises, not the other way around. So it is impossible to grasp and overcome these political crises if we only condemn these populism from the surface instead of analyzing the representative fracture behind it. It's difficult. So that, I think, it's my basic kind of the judgments for the political crisis. So in short, we can see that the global ecological problems, the contradictions between the developing countries and the developed countries, the developed countries' unwillingness to take responsibility, and the burden of developing countries' development, they don't want to stop it. Its development are all problems brought about by the global division of labor. But now there was no global solution framework and no global agreement can be reached up to now, though there was efforts continuously. This is an important contradiction encountered today. When we still describe these new contradictions and new crises in the older language, democratic or the non-democratic language, market and non-market economies, we will actually miss the real crux of the crisis, because the methods provided by these older language can't solve the representative fracture. and can't respond to the socio-economic conditions behind the fracture. The repetition of the older language will only temporarily form some kind of the social mobilization, domestically, globally, and so on and so forth. But it's actually effective in solving problems. We really need a new thinking. The new thinking needs to synthesize all kinds of heritages in history and summarize them and theorize them, maybe. The first thing I think to think about it is our region, for example, the long history of Asia. What are the conditions for different cultures, religions, and communities to coexist? Because Asia up to now is still so diverse. Can the political, geopolitical, geographical, and cultural conditions be innovative in the contemporary era? Instead of simply going back to the old methods, we should extract the valuable elements from the older methods. It's not, when we talk about history, not necessarily mean that we want to go back to the history, trying to find some helpful elements for rethinking. After summing up our developing, we can surpass this kind of structure in the contemporary world, which is the conflict between the so-called nationality and nationalism. This is the first question that we need to think about. Actually, that we really need to surpass the 19th century and early 20th century legacy to rethink the history, to rethink about the order, domestically and regionally and globally. The second problem is the relationship between the social equality and the diversity. The inequality we are facing today is manifested in regional aspects and the social strata, as well as among countries. Instead of going back to the old concept of equality, we should further consider the relationship between the equality and the diversity. In Asia, for example, or even within Eastern Asia, there were institutional diversity, social systems are so different, cultural diversity, social diversity, and so on and so forth. Under these diverse conditions, we should explore the conditions that can coexist and be peaceful. Because today, peace is a truly global issue. How to avoid the outbreak of large-scale conflicts and wars and seek the road of peace needs to be discussed again now. In this sense, although the forms of some struggles against the hegemony in the 20th century have changed, the process of dehegemony or the dehegemony should not end, because the structure of the hegemony is the origin of today's social conflicts. But in this transformation process itself, there was a lot of the uncertainty and a new crisis could emerge here and could be even dangerous. We must understand this instead of maintaining this hegemony, but in any case, so that the whole regional relations tend to be balanced and equal, and the order of multipolar world can take shape. This is our second point. Third, I think the large-scale social projects, such as so-called poverty alleviation, the rural revitalizing projects in China, in a certain sense, we still not sure, it's only the beginning. The success or the failure determines whether Chinese society can enter a new and a fairer historical period. These should not be confined to one country or one region, but to explore the different institutional forms to solve the poverty in the world, so unequal now. To reduce the gap between the rich and the poor, thereby reducing the social conflicts. Politically, it is necessary to develop the new political forms so that ordinary people can also obtain the possibility of self-expression. Otherwise, it is difficult to avoid the rise and the conflict of so-called the populism. Finally, in the past, we often discuss the phenomena of regional integration in Asia and Europe after the end of Cold War, or the efforts of regional integration beyond or based on the nation states, which can be said to have achieved partial success. But today, this process whether in Europe or Asia is in a new crisis. In Europe, for example, the BRICS is the sign. In Asia, whether it can be called a new Cold War, whether we still can talk about the new Cold War or not. But however, with the adjustment of the Sino-Japanese relations and the implementations of American policy of returning to Asia, the region has once again fallen into the crisis of regional contradiction. This regional contradiction is not only confined to the region. Actually, we can see the military alliance, different kinds of, like the United States, Britain, and Australia is a new military alliance. The so-called Five Eye Alliance, the Eastward expansion NATO, and the great influence of all these powers structures on the reconstruction of relations in this region. In this sense, on the one hand, we need to re-explore the new ways of regional integration because there have been or are still relatively successful cases. It's some like Asian and some other. On the other hand, the Belt Road Initiative, though is still a lot of the debates itself, whether or not they can be create a new model. It's still, it depends on the practice. It is not the integrate, but basically, these kind of the new project, the initiative, what made it different from old pattern of the regional integration? It is not integrated in a single region, but also cross-regional. So in today's transportation and other technical conditions, such a model should become, it's not, I mean, talk about model means the trans-regional and a different, not only based on the geopolitical relations. And so a kind of the model of thinking about the new space became possible and necessary. So we need to think about the space in different way from the old geopolitical relations. Its purpose is to enhance the people's communication, increase the interconnection, and form a new and a peaceful global order. So, of course, at this moment, I can't see the sudden change. Partly we can't see whether, for example, this year will be the beginning of the sudden change too. Partly because the old contradictions are not formed in one day. Even if the pandemic will ease, it will not return to the old so-called normal state in the past. The superposition of the new contradictions creates the new conditions. Today, I think that peace has become an important issue in this region and in the global scale, which needs the common attention and exploration of the whole world, of course, for China and Asia too. So that's why I think the issue of the community of shared future for the humankind or the expanded community of fate is a necessary issue we need to exploit further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang Hui, for giving us this very broad and very rich introduction. I've noted down a number of points I would like to pick up, and maybe I will just go step by step and start with something you mentioned in the very beginning. And this is both the role of language and of history. First of all, what you said and what resonated with me very much is that we are now at a point in time where the world globally is facing unprecedented challenges, and yet we are trying to solve, it looks, the problems of the 21st century with the approaches, the thought patterns, the language of the 20th century. Or or even earlier. And one thing that tends to be ignored very much, at least in the Western, or in particular in the transatlantic context, maybe even in the United States more than in Europe, is the role of historical memory. One thing that is maybe not aware to those in the audience who do not come from a Chinese studies background is that in Chinese, there is de facto no past tense. So I am and I was is more or less the same. There is a story somebody told me that when her father passed away, in English, she needed to switch from my father is to my father was, while in Chinese, it was still 我爸爸是, meaning that just emotionally, when she was speaking Chinese, her father was much closer to her than in English. And this is, this small example is just to explain that the historical memory in history is much, much more present in Chinese and in China than it is in the West, because it always is. Nevertheless, I mean, there is enough talk about that in Europe, we kind of just managed to digest the consequences of the World War II so that we can start digesting the consequences of World War I. But when we talk about dealing with China, one thing that can be observed, especially in the US context, that there is not very much awareness for historical memory. Not even going far behind, but I've heard like recently at a high profile event, somebody saying, well, Afghanistan, it's gone, we're over it, we're moving on, although, this is quite a recent thing. So my first point would be to ask to you, Professor Wang Hui, what is the relevance of historical memory? And is it something that we need to bring much, much more to the table, in particular in light of the fact, and this is something I observe in my own research, that the debates that are taking place now are very much parallel to the debates that were taking place in the 1950s, just immediately after the Second World War. The language, the wording, the conflicts we observed back then between the United States and China are not at all unsimilar to what we observe today. While the challenges are completely different and global, talking about the pandemics and climate change. So how do we, what is your point on the historical memory, and how can we manage to bring it into awareness, especially considering that in the West, we don't have the language for that, and our governments change so quickly that there is no institutional memory.
So I answered now? Okay. Okay, thank you. Yes, a lot of people talk about these issues, about the role of the history in China. And I remember that long ago, the first time when I visit America, the people told me that the history means that something happened 20 years ago. But how can you talk about the 5,000 years ago, or the 2,000 years ago, or the something? But partly because I think that the historical memories in Europe was somehow something was very deep. And for example, the Holocaust, so much discussions about the Holocaust. If you read the whole historiography in all the comments and read back to that, and even now in the geopolitics, a lot of the rhetoric came from that period now. So it's not necessary to say that the China was specific, have the special memory for the history. But on the other hand, I think that in this region, yes, the role of history is played a big. I don't want to say before that some observers, sinologists, the old, very traditional sinologists, were trying to treat the history in China as the rule of the religion in the West. So they always appeal to the God or the religion. But China was somehow, they always talk about the history. To some extent, not completely right, but to some extent, I think it's an interesting observation in any case. But what I can say that the problem is that there's so many elements of history were still as a living reality in our conditions. So that's, I think, very important. Not necessarily mean that people want to go back to the early stage, but these phenomena, in order to explain this reality, you had to go back to the early stages, different stages. So that's the first. Second, just like the case you mentioned, for example, the retreat of American troops from Afghanistan. They simply became Afghanistan, gradually became the forgotten corner in somewhere far away from some places, and nothing to do with their own history in any case. That was the pattern of the maritime era. You know, this is why I say that the 16th century as a new starting point, that because the beginning of the maritime era, some powers by the new technology went to some place, no any connection with their own society. So they go there, they're settlers or something. Only through the settlers, they created the connection with their own home countries. But in Chinese case, all these regional relations was mixed, embedded in our daily lives. So if you talk about this issue, Tibet issue, or any other Western regions issues, it always goes back to the early histories. So in that sense, it's different. I think that's why the historical memory is shaped by history itself. So sometimes it's only, you can say some people will specifically have the long memory or short memory, but that pattern itself was also shaped by different historic conditions. It became the historical unconsciousness, maybe. So that's maybe the observation here.
You're absolutely right to say that in Europe, historical memory very much plays a role. And I think there is a case just unfolding at this moment where it comes into play. And this is the question whether Germany should sell weapons to Ukraine so that Ukraine can defend itself against Russia. And this is something that is, has created a lot of international debates about Germany's role internationally, in parts damaging German reputation. But what is mostly not mentioned, that the reason why Germany is not selling weapons to Ukraine has a lot to do with the sense of historical debt vis-a-vis Russia because of World War II. The impression that I get from talking to colleagues in the US at the moment is that in the administration in particular, because there are not as many regional specialists in the administration that there used to be in the past, there is just no sense for the sensitivities anymore in the same way. One other question I wanted to pick up is the role of the Belt and Road Initiative, which, at least in the communication of the Chinese government, is described as synonymous with the community of shared future of mankind. And the Xi Jinping has been saying that the Belt and Road Initiative is the manifestation of China's commitment to multilateralism, a manifestation of the vision of a shared future for mankind, and an alternative way of multilateralism that is not based on alliances, but on joint consultations. Now, alliances are a term that is very close to the transatlantic discourse. And what we have seen more recently is the United States going to East Asia, to the Asia Pacific, with a proposal of establishing an alliances. And we have observed a lot of reserved stance from the ASEAN and from the East Asian countries, not because of the United States per se, but because of the term alliance. Because in the understanding of East Asian countries, alliance means that you go to war together. And this is a commitment East Asian countries are not willing to give in the most part. So obviously there is not enough understanding of, again, in terms of language, what the specific term means in the East Asian context. And at the same time, the Belt and Road Initiative is portrayed as a problem for the West. And we have seen initiatives coming out from the transatlantic context, being in the G7 Build Back Better World, or the Blue Dot Initiative of the United States, or the very new European initiative Global Gateway, which propose alternative infrastructure initiatives, but end up looking more about solving the Western China problem instead of solving the development challenges of the countries. And a big underestimation is is how the BRI perceived, for example, in Africa. And there is a very interesting interview by Judy Moore, who is former Minister of Public Works of Liberia, who said that even if the BRI is going to fail completely, it is still a success because for the first time, somebody came up with a plan to connect the poorest countries of the world with the richest countries of the world. And even if it fails, the idea by itself is innovative. And one could ask the question, why was there no European infrastructure plan, given that Europe is an African neighbor? Why has there been no equivalent American plan, given that Africa is an upcoming and very important actor, and in the end, the world consists of more than just Europe, United States, and China. But while China obviously has to offer important global public goods, it still stays an authoritarian country. And it appears that for the West, this contradiction that you can be authoritarian and internationalist is extremely difficult to resolve and cannot be resolved as long as one stays in the thought patterns of the 20th century. So I was wondering what your thoughts would be on that.
Thank you. I'm not a specialist on these the One Belt Road Initiative issue. But I think you're right that first of all, we also need to go back to for the comparison that the infrastructure. That's what when I visit African countries, I talk to the local people in different regions and the Latin American countries too. And the basic attitudes, they of course, a lot of the problems, we have to face that. But on the other hand, general reaction, my impression were positive. They really want to have that because you need to develop its infrastructure. And in the 20th century, before the 200 or 300 years, that a colonial time, but it's so little the infrastructure developed. So that's the comparison. I think the second issue is that the Chinese way of the Belt Road Initiative, especially China, argued that it is not the Chinese project. It is only the initiative. China initiated and want to jointly and different participation from different players. And so this, I think it's important. And also, this is also the strategy, not only in the Belt Road Initiative, but think about the regional orders. Partly because, of course, for example, in Europe or in America, many intellectuals and scholars reflect upon the nation state and the sovereignty, right? So that's why they go beyond the internationalism or the cosmopolitanism, and criticize that the concept of sovereignty and so on. So the limits there, as I said, there's an older language. But on the other hand, in the 20th century, China had a long history struggle for the independence. So that's why they know that the sovereignty means a lot to so many third world countries. They don't want to hand over to some other superstructure, the domination, and so on and so forth. That's why the basic idea of the interconnectivity or the Belt Road Initiative based on the recognition of that, their independence. I mean, the different countries had made the last decision, what kind of project that they have to develop is their own decision. So that in that sense, is a respect for the legacy of national liberation movements in the 20th century. That's a long history and miserable to some extent. So it's a great but a miserable story. So that's why China know that in that sense, it's also our the memory too. So in this way, you need to find the interconnectivity based on the recognition of diversity and based on the certain historical achievements for those non-Western countries achieved through the long process of the 20th century, even now. So I think this is a basic idea. So you can compare the behavior. China didn't, if any kind of the country, it's, for example, the business, some successful, some the failures. China did use the sanction, like America, to unilaterally sanction for some other countries, didn't know such behavior and no such institutional base. So you can see these were so many discussions. So here, for me, I have not. I am not, as I said, I'm not the specialist on the very different cases. I know that there are some controversial cases, but basically I had summarized. I did summarize some key concepts that for the Belt Road Initiative. I think China also need to develop this philosophy. Belt, road, corridors, the bridge, right? The China or the Asian European bridge, that the railway, Sino-European railway, and the corridor, Sino-Pakistan, Sino-India corridors, and the one belt and the one road. All these basic concepts, I treat these as a concept because implying the different types of the interconnectivities, and also in which reflect the recognition of the diversity. So it means that it's not the full integration became the one dominated by one power, but still maintain the respect for the diversity here. So I think these are the philosophy. I hope that the Chinese way will more or less follow this logic. But of course, we know that this is a global markets issue and a capital issue. This so it's some conflicts and the problems. It's inevitable. So how to rethink of the developmentalism? It's not only for Chinese case. It's also the case for the Belt Road Initiative too.
Yeah, I'm very grateful that you raised this point because I'm also not an international relations scholar. I come from sinology, but my specialty is critical development. And as a critical development scholar, I try to look at the bigger picture. And one final question I would like to ask before we move on to the Q&A and opening the discussion to our listeners in the virtual space is while listening to you, the question that came up to me is whether democracies actually need an antagonist to be better, because what I have been observing and what is a big debate in the critical development community, that at the moment it seems that the West measures China against what it itself would like to be, and not against what it is. So while, you know, if using the language of political psychology, it's in a way of dealing, you know, with your own wounds and deflecting them to the others. I mean, we have the same pattern in China with the instrumentalization of nationalism vis-a-vis Japan when domestic issues arise, and hearing both in Europe and in the United States, in particular during the Trump era, China was used very much to deflect from domestic issues. That being said, there are, you know, in both cases, as we all know, enough issues to be addressed. But the question to me is, if, you know, Europe and the United States would to become better versions of themselves, do they need China to be the antagonist to become that? Or basically in a similar way, like the social democracy in Germany, in Western Germany, developed because there was the GDR. And there was kind of the need to come up with a social structure that was in a way compatible. So do democracies need the antagonistic China to become better?
I think that the first, maybe I will answer these questions from different layers. The first of all, substantively speaking, we need a more democratic society. That's true. I recognize that. However, the rhetoric of democracy became so narrow now, partly because in the post-Cold War era, the democracy, different type, different democracy, right? But in the post-Cold War period, that's the democracy only means some formal democracy rather than the substantive democracy. So that's I think the big issue. Let's see the social democracy, for example, the social welfare systems that developed in the 20th century without the competition between the two social systems at that time. Like I take the Germany as the case, the East and the West competition, that the improvements of the social welfare system is difficult to imagine for both sides. So in that sense, it's not necessarily mean that the antithesis or the antagonist, but a certain kind of the social political system, the competition between that from outside give you know that some limits of your social system, you still need to reflect the shortage of your own system. That's necessary. Because when we think about the only one form without outside, it's dangerous for any society, which means that you lack the perspective to reflect upon your own self. So when I often last years, so many times, and when I talk to the European intellectuals, for example, my observation, sorry for that, I should say that, I really learned so much from them. They are so reflexive and critical to their own problems. However, when the topic switched to China, no difference. It's immediately sucked back to the mainstream media. The arguments are so superficial. Honestly, these are some very critical minds, but still, these are really the trap of thinking. We need to develop the new idea about the so-called difference. We need to rethink about this, the first. Second, why I said that it became the formal? Because a lot of people here, I think that especially in America and in Europe, many scholars, I learned from their reflections on these systems. But when they talk about China, there's only the dichotomy of authoritarian and a democracy. And what you argue for was of course, the freedom of expression is absolutely necessary. It's a need, and also the voting system, right? You need to the election, the voting, and so on and so forth. But then, what's the difference between Russia and China? Russia had the election system. Even Iran and even more, the the voting rate, however, is also the authoritarian, right? It's from the European perspective, is also the authoritarian. But when you talk about China, you talk about these formal systems, you talk to other countries, you have no such standards at all, which means that this term itself is inflation. It's in inflation. It's not necessarily mean that the democracy is not important, but the concept of the term used, the rhetoric itself, it's really became more and more empty, and sometimes became self-assertion or the self-confirmation for the maintaining certain kind of the sense of the reciprocity. So that's, I think, it's the made the things the worse, because once you stuck there, the people here, we are also need the everybody, especially the when we talk about the social equality, we talk about really the everybody should have their rights for the expression. But when you talk about these kind of the issues, we need to think about what's the crisis now, the substantively. And once you only do this, that in a dichotomical, the framework, and then it's missed something. Because basically different social, as you said, that the different social systems still has, each of them has their weakness and the strengths. You need to mutually learn from each other. And so that's what I think why we need a certain kind of reflection on in a conceptual level to think about the issue of democracy. So you can see that what happened, for example, Trump was elected, and then people label him as like a dictator and so on and so forth. But in the diplomatic relations, has anything really substantively changed of American attitudes towards Asia or America? I don't see that. So what's the result of, what's the background of that? So we need to think about this. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for a very insightful conversation, Professor Wang Hui and Marina Rudyak. We have quite a few questions. We have been running out of time because of a fascinating exchange, but I think we should take some extra time. We have, as I said, quite a few questions. I would like to look at the last three questions because they all have a focus on our perception of history that you have been discussing, Professor Wang Hui. And we have one question from Alaina Marangos, and she asked if not all our current discussions have an element of history that only we are not aware of, possibly. T. Kampen reminds us that education and also formal education plays a huge role in our perception of history, and maybe there are differences in various countries like the United States or European countries or China. And the third question that is concerned with our perception of history is a question from Hans Hasso Kersten, and he says that in democracies, the role of elections and media bring the present moment very much into focus necessarily. And he also has another argument, and he asks, and that is a somewhat provocative question, he asks whether or not Chinese and Russian leaders will be very much living in the present, if you want, because they may or might want to cash in, as he says, cash in on the short-term weakness of Western democracies. So you have three questions about the role of history here. Please go ahead, Professor Wang.
Sorry, can you hint, sorry, I didn't. The last question I remember that. Can you repeat one sentence, 1 and 2?
The first two?
Yeah.
The first question is about our current discussions and whether or not all current discussions always have an underlying element of history that
Yes,
we are just not aware of. And the second question is about the role of education. There might be different forms of education that focus more or less or in different ways on history in countries like China or the United States or European countries.
Okay. Okay, thank you. The first, it is again about the history. So the history is we're living together with the ghost of history, that it's inevitable. I think that the first of all, it's really related to how to understand the history. Sometimes history is unpredictable, right? So it's almost like the future, unpredictable. Many historians say that changed a little bit, a lot. Obviously, the current situation never happened before. It's a really new condition, but many things we can find the elements from the history. That in China, I can say that I give some examples. Some unprecedented moment happened to China. The Chinese intelligentsia and the rulers even, they try to imagine this new reality through the lens of history. I've given the one example, maybe. By the end of the 19th century or the beginning of 20th century, especially in the 19th century, that was a very new situation for China. China was forced to sign different treaties, and China suddenly realized that China was only one country that among different powers. And now, and even recognize the weakness that we need to learn from the others to advance ourselves. So at that time, but you know that at that time, like the intellectuals like Wang Hui and some others, imagine that the global system as the so-called the period of the warring state re-emerged in the global scale. The warring state was the period of the 2,000 years ago. There was a different states competed with each other and find a way. But from this imagination, they gradually grasped the changes and the contemporaneity of their own. So they developed a new idea for the reforms and so on and so forth. So learn from history, maybe it's certain kind of behavior for many Chinese, I think, try to rethink. But what happened in the 20th century, I would argue that different from before, that the history was not only our own history, but other countries' history became our own history, part of the history. For example, if you look at the intellectual debates in China, we so many discussions for like a German Enlightenment or the Scottish Enlightenment, French Revolution, American Revolution, and the Russian Revolution, and so on and so forth, and the Japanese Reform and others, or the third world countries. There are a lot of discussions about others' history. Actually, we're trying to deal with our own reality. So that was, I think, the phenomenon. Now it's the same, that when we think about this issue, for example, the Belt Road initiatives, the inspiration came from Silk Road, which was actually the German innovation, the German invention in the 19th, 20th century. It was not the traditional term for China, but a kind of the Western civilization of the Chinese Asian practice. But suddenly that became the contemporary practice, Belt Road Initiative. So these are not necessarily mean that the Belt Road Initiative was a repeat of the Silk Road. It's something from there to connected the history and the contemporary practice. I think this is the first. The second, I think it's about education. It is true. It's very important, the education issue. And I remember that it's about 20 years ago, in some historians from the Balkan countries trying to work together for the kind of the textbook or the historical book was done by the different part. We know that after the wars and the historical memory and also the hatred to each other were there, how to find the way of reconciliation for these. And maybe inspired by this in Asia, in East Asia, there was an effort. And the Chinese historian, Japanese historian, and the Korean historian, they try to work together for the common history, the historical textbook. They did, they publicized. However, it was not so influential. And also in the process, it's inevitably so many conflicts and contradictions. So eventually, I don't say this is a failure, because a failure for me is a productive concept, because every time you can learn from the failures, but not necessarily means the failure was the end, is the end. Failure means something, conditions was not prepared. We need to create the new conditions for these kind of the common historical learning. I think it's very important now. Like in East Asia, the Japan, China, South Korea, or other not. When I talk about the South Korea, it naturally sounds like they excluded the North Korea. But all these countries, Vietnam, Mongolia, should be work together for the possible common textbook for the historical learnings. So that's the intellectual project. I think it's still necessary for not only for this region, but for, I think, for the everywhere, I think. The third, again, is about democracy, or whether or not China has, or the Russia or the leaders, and use that the crisis of democracy survive and so on and so forth. Actually, I remember that the long ago. It's I had the fortune to talk to the former chancellor of Germany, Western Germany, actually the Helmut Schmidt. He actually has some insightful comments about these issues, but he said that so many things it's not about because even the crisis give you the possibilities for this and for that, but whether or not that the change of the certain kind of the leadership will change the whole country, I don't think so. Of course, it's a huge influential, but the problem is not maybe the Helmut Schmidt said that the question is that at that time is the Crimea crisis is approaching. So he said that we should reflect it, what we did. It's the result of the Russian action. To some extent, we also should take some responsibility for this. However, he said that at that time, he said, I'm the minority among the European leaders. He said that, and so on and so forth. But I'm not so good in the political science and the international politics. But I think that the any kind of the question that about these, we need to start it from I think the general challenges, because besides no matter what kind of political form and the political systems, the basic challenge are much more same. The ecological crisis, the social inequality, and the whole way of the production, where it's still and also the traditional relationship, the regional relations, where all these kind of the issues, the common challenges, it's in front of us. So in that sense, we really need to rethink about these kind of the challenges and from then to think about the weakness of each political and the social systems. So that find the way for the improve it or the self-improve it. So that's, I think it's more productive.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, as I said before, we are running out of time, or I should say we ran out of time a long time ago, but I would say we still want to ask you 3 more questions about the future. And all these 3 questions are not only about the future, but about China's role in the future. There is Barbara Mittler, and I will ask you, the 3 of you, to ask your questions in a minute. Barbara Mittler wants to know about the new language that will be spoken in the future in the 21st century. And in connection with China, there is Dr. Agota Reves, who wants to know from you about the community of shared future for mankind and how China will, what the role of China is here. And a 3rd question from Nikola Radinovich about more specifically Chinese soft power in Asia. Maybe Barbara, you want to go ahead with your question, and maybe we can collect these 3 questions for reasons of limited time. Barbara, please go ahead, turn on your mic, please.
Yeah, very briefly, I was cheeky. I asked, do we have a new 新中国未来记 here? And is the language of the future that you talked about in the very beginning, we need a new language, is it going to be Chinese? Next.
And then we have Dr. Agota Reves. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm a sinologist coming originally from Hungary, but now based in Berlin. And my question is, so you talked a lot about the shared future for mankind. Shared future for mankind. It's perceived basically not as an international concept, but as a very Chinese concept. So, and because it is labeled as Chinese, it actually reinforces all those binaries that you were talking about, all those old binaries. So it actually reinforces East-West, democracy, autocracy. So do you see any way out?
And thank you. And the 3rd question comes from Nikola Radionovich. Please go ahead. Or should I explain the question? It's a question about Chinese soft power in Asia, and if China should not use a different language in order to improve the soft power in Asia.
Okay, it's because it's a very complicated and broad questions. It's difficult to answer in such a short minutes. But thank you, Barbara, for your 新中国未来记. It's old. Actually, the story, short stories about the future. The future was the feature of the 20th century Chinese thinking, was deeply influenced by the West, I think, reversed the timeline because in Confucian idea was the golden time was always past rather than the future. The future was really came from it became the influential in the 20th century. That's so many discussions about the future. Now we still, again, whether or not we talk about the future. So that's the big issue. When we talk about the 新中国未来记 or the new type of the 新中国未来记, some people will talk about like a science fiction or like Liu Cixin and some others talk. But I think that still the future was suppressed in the contemporary conditions under our foot. So we need to rethink about the reality for search for the alternatives. I think that it's about the principle of hope, of course, that there was a German idea, maybe it came from the where is the future? Because the future is not in the future, but within the reality. But a lot of elements of the future surprised by the history and the current power relations. We need to retrieve it through the practice to find it. So that's why we talk about the future. It's almost when we talk about the history, we talk about the future too. So that's why we already talk so much about this. Second is the community of shared the future for the humankind and China. What's the role of China there? I think that when we talk about these, the future, or different type of in China we had, it's not only only one idea about the shared future in China. For you know, when the 新中国未来记 and Liang Qichao's time, it's kind of, we already wrote the 大通书, the great community, or the great harmony, in which is no the boundary of the states. However, still some kind of the governance there. This is the one type. It's more or less based on the science and the technology, the latitude, the longitude, and so on and so forth, like a digital time, how that develops. But on the other hand, I think in Chinese version now, we also talk about the recognition of diversity and certain different cultures. So in the future, means not necessarily means that all the cultures disappeared, only follow the one logic, but still the multitudes or the multiplicity within it was necessary, in which in that multiple society, Chinese culture obviously will have some positions there.
We've lost Wang Hui. Right. Now. Are you coming back, Wang Hui? We're not hearing you. Okay.
Okay, should we give it another minute or two to see if he's coming back?
Yes. Otherwise, we could start thanking Marina.
Exactly. Exactly. I guess I also see that some participants have to leave now. And so also in the name of Barbara Mittler, I would like to thank Professor Wang Hui and Professor Marina Rudyak for this insightful exchange. Our series of encounters will continue on March 31st, when we will welcome Reinhard Bütikofer, a member of the European Parliament. Reinhard Bütikofer is Foreign Affairs spokesman of the Greens in the Committee on Foreign Affairs, and the chair of the European Parliament's Delegation for Relations with the People's Republic of China. Please join us on March 31st for this conversation. We will post more information on this event on our website soon. And with this, I would like to end this session.